Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the Spencer family, Community Health System, Harris Ranch Resort, Producers Dairy, Valley Children's Healthcare, and The Wonderful Company. Additional support provided by from the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's public universities. This is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zanti.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. California passed the Voters' Choice Act in 2016 in an effort to make voting more accessible, but some argue that the results have been mixed. Today we'll be discussing voter turnout in California and how the Voters' Choice Act has influenced these numbers with Eric McGhee, Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thanks for joining us, Eric. Appreciate you being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's jump right in. For viewers at home who may not be familiar with the Voters' Choice Act or the VCA, can you explain why the act was passed and what it established?
Yeah, so it was passed a little over, well, not quite 10 years ago now, actually. And the idea behind it was to make it easier for people to vote, just to sort of take away some of the friction points in the voting process and try and make the people who actually showed up and cast a ballot look more like the general population of California. The nuts and bolts of the act were to shift from a system where you had to request a vote by mail ballot if you wanted to mail your ballot in, to one where everybody got a vote by mail ballot by default. And then also changing the in-person voting experience from one where you would vote at if you wanted to vote in person, you would vote at your local polling place. And you had to go to that local polling place. They shifted to a system where they'd have a smaller number of professionally staffed vote centers. And those vote centers would be available to anybody in the county. So if you wanted to go vote while you were, out doing your errands or when you were at work instead of at home, you could do that if you wanted to. They also had some requirements for making drop boxes available, unstaffed drop boxes, which are kind of like a mailbox, but only just for your ballot, just for ballots. And then they also had some early voting requirements. So there were a certain number of early in-person voting options that had to be made available as part of the act. And all of these were meant to make the process of voting a little bit less painful than it would otherwise be.
And now with the passing of the Voters' Choice Act, what were the responses from county officials? Were they positive, or were some counties more hesitant to implement the VCA?
Yeah, and so you're raising a good point there, which is that the VCA didn't require that counties adopt this new system. It just gave them the choice to do it. And at first, 5 counties made the switch in 2018. They made that switch, and those counties had a pretty positive experience with it, but it was just those 5 counties. Then in 2020, quite a number of counties made the switch, including Los Angeles County, which is, the big kahuna of California. It's like about a third of the state. So that was a big deal when they decided to make the switch. And of course, that was also the year that we had the pandemic. And so while a number of counties did make that switch in 2020, we also decided as a state, in order to cope with the pandemic, to switch to giving everybody in the state a vote by mail ballot by default.
What did that process look like? Obviously, you're moving from the traditional precinct model to this vote center model. Was it a smooth process, or were there some hiccups in that implementation?
I think it was challenging for the counties that made the switch. It did cost some money to make the switch. They had to get certain kinds of equipment in order to, one of the keys of having any location in the county be available for voting is that you have to allow all of those locations to communicate with some central copy of the voter file for that county, so that you have some record of who's voted and who hasn't. You don't want somebody going over to one location voting and then going over to another location and voting again. Similarly, typically when you have a polling place system, somebody shows up at their polling place and they know at that polling place exactly what ballot you should receive, what races you are qualified to vote for because of your, your residence. So, what assembly races, what congressional races, et cetera, right? And they had to make that system available in all the locations, and you had to have an easy way of figuring out what ballot somebody needed, and then print out that ballot if they didn't have one. So this was all part of the VCA process, and was not necessarily simple, and there's definitely a cost to that transition. There are also, under the law, were some requirements for outreach to the community, for language accessibility and for disabled access, to make sure that everybody was able to use the new facilities that were being created as a part of the transition. So there were definitely a number of things that had to be done in order to make the VCA work, and it wasn't cost-free. But so I would say there probably were some hiccups along the way, and more than hiccups, it was just that it wasn't necessarily easy, but a number of counties did decide to do it.
Thank you, Eric. Up next, we'll discuss how voter turnout has changed since the passage of the VCA. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Eric, thanks again for joining the Maddy Report today to talk about the Voters' Choice Act. We'll now be discussing how voter turnout has been affected since applying the Voters' Choice Act. As we learned in the previous segment, the VCA was introduced as a way to bring more people out to vote, increase that voter turnout, especially in underrepresented groups. However, in your report, data from recent elections suggests that maybe this goal hasn't been fully realized yet. So let's look at this a little bit further. Overall, how have voters responded to the Voters' Choice Act changes? And also, what public information efforts were undertaken by the counties to inform voters about the changes in voting?
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is just to set the context, because it may not be entirely clear from the information I've given so far. But the Voters' Choice Act is no longer unusual in sending every voter a vote by mail ballot. That's now something we do in every county. And that wasn't anticipated when the Voters' Choice Act was first passed, but the pandemic and its aftermath have left us with a system where everybody gets a vote by mail ballot by default. And so now the thing that is different about the VCA is this in-person voting experience. It's the change to a vote center system with all the drop boxes, in addition, the early voting options. But also, as a part of that is that the nearest location for voting in person is farther away, just because there's fewer of them. So the requirements for the density of in-person voting options are lower in the VCA because it was assumed that you would have more flexibility about the location you went to. So gone is your neighborhood polling place that's right nearby, that maybe in some facility that you're very familiar with. And now it's, could be in a facility like that, could be somewhere else entirely that you're not as familiar with. Could be you're trying to go and find a vote center somewhere farther than from home while you are out and about on your errands or whatever. But it's just a different kind of process, and there's not as many of those locations, and the nearest one is farther away. So there's kind of two ways to think about this. Is this something that's likely to encourage people to turn out at a higher rate? Is it going to make it easier? This particular aspect of the change, again, not setting aside the question of the vote by mail ballots, is this in-person voting part going to make it easier for people to participate? And there's definitely arguments both ways, right? You could argue the flexibility side, but then also argue the distance and the disruption to the normal routine kind of side of things. And one would be positive and the other would be negative. There also was, as you mentioned, a lot of effort to reach out to voters to try to communicate about these changes. That was also part of the requirements of the law. So it's not that these counties just dove in and didn't do anything. They were informing voters that they were part of a new system, and that it was, there were going to be all these different options, and it was going to be a little bit of a change. And so the question is not even whether the communication they did around it was whether they did any communication, but whether perhaps they did enough communication or communication to the right groups of people. So in terms of what we found when we looked at the impact of the Voters' Choice Act, we were comparing places that changed to the Voters' Choice Act over this period of time that we studied, and looked at, do people who we were able to track the same registrants over time and see whether when they switched into the VCA system, they were more likely or less likely to turn out to vote compared to people who were in a county that didn't make any switch. And the answer is that we kind of did two separate comparisons, one between the two midterms of 2018 and 2022, midterm being an election where the president isn't on the ballot. And so they tend to be lower turnout affairs. And then the one comparison of 2020 and 2024, which are presidential elections, so they're kind of higher profile things. Those are both very exciting elections. They were both much higher turnout than the comparable midterms, right? And what we found is that there were actually, between the two midterms, there was actually a decline in turnout in VCA counties. So that it appeared that the switch to the VCA system hurt turnout in those counties. But we saw a little bit of the opposite effect between the two presidential elections. So maybe a little bit of a nudge up in turnout. When you dive down then and look at specific groups, in particular communities of color and young people, who are both groups that where there's a lot of concern about their low participation rates, and where there's a lot of effort, and VCA was one of those efforts to try to improve participation, to make the electorate look kind of, as I had said at the outset, look more like the general population of California. And when you kind of dive into those groups, you see that actually between those two midterms, it was Latinos who saw the biggest drop off in their turnout. But not really the same thing in the presidential. In the presidential, the biggest decline, even though overall there was an improvement in VCA counties, there was a decline among Black voters between those two presidential elections in the VCA counties. So we are seeing some of those negative effects with certain groups. We also saw for young people the same basic pattern as the overall pattern, which was a decline between the two midterms for VCA counties, and a slight increase in between the two presidentials. So it's really kind of a mixed bag. The effects that we found were generally pretty small. They weren't huge. So, in some cases with some groups, they could be a little bit larger, but generally they weren't enormous. The thing that was more concerning was just that they were not uniformly positive. And the goal of the reform was to try and encourage more turnout. And so if we have some cases where there's less turnout, that's a little bit disconcerting.
Thank you, Eric. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion on voter turnout after implementing the Voters' Choice Act. Eric, I think you made an important clarification in the previous segment about how when the Voters' Choice Act was originally passed, it wasn't anticipated the pandemic would sort of catalyze this implementation of vote by mail ballots to every voter throughout the state of California. And so I think it's important, that's an important consideration as we're having this discussion. You also addressed, some of the changes in racial and ethnic groups voting in the last several years since the passage of the VCA. I also want to drill a little bit down into maybe some of the logistics of implementing these vote centers. How might the distance to a vote center or a drop box affect a voter's likelihood of turning out, especially those maybe who are new voters, they're first-time voters?
Yeah, so we did look at this question of whether how far you were away from your nearest location would affect your likelihood of turning out. We were only able to do that part of the analysis for the comparison of the midterm elections, the 2018 to 2022. And you could kind of go just like with the overall effect, you could go kind of both ways on this, because on the one hand, the Voters' Choice Act puts the nearest location farther away because there's fewer vote centers than there were polling places. On the other hand, it's very flexible. You can go to any vote center that you happen to be nearby, and so that flexibility might offset any effective distance that you would see. And so, it could be that it really isn't even sensible to talk about distance to the nearest voting location in the VCA context because of that flexibility. So what we found is that it really kind of didn't make too much difference either way. So there wasn't a lot of effect of the distance to your nearest location in VCA counties, and there wasn't much effect even in the traditional counties. So just a pretty like comparable turnout and comparable change in turnout when you switch to a VCA county. Like it wasn't like distance was an important factor. If anything, those who were farthest or were moved farthest from their nearest location actually saw their turnout a little bit of an increase in turnout, which is very counterintuitive, right? Um, our best guess for what's going on there is that because in other research that's been conducted outside of California on the effect of distance to voting, they definitely have found an effect. Like the farther away you are from your nearest polling place, the less likely you are to vote. But in the California context, uh, everybody's getting a vote by mail ballot by default. And so as you get farther away from that nearest location, it's very possible that people are just making the switch to mailing in their ballot. They say, I'm gonna try to use one of these in-person locations, but if I get too far out, I'm just gonna mail it, right? And so that's the real key flexibility that makes the distance piece not as critical as it might otherwise be. And so we might just not have to worry quite as much about that distance piece in the California context these days. And it is worth noting that we've done other research looking at vote by mail balloting specifically. So the effect of switching to all vote by mail as opposed to these other changes that you get with the VCA with in-person voting. And the effect of all vote by mail specifically is positive. It produces an increase in turnout overall and actually closes some of participation gaps between voters of color and other voters. So we do see some of those positive effects that we were looking for in that vote by mail piece of it. But again, that's something that applies to the state as a whole now and not specifically to VCA counties.
We're going to take another quick break, and then we'll be right back with Eric McGhee from the Public Policy Institute of California. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Eric, thank you again for joining us on the Maddy Report today. Before you go, just a final couple of thoughts and questions for you. We're talking about the Voters' Choice Act and how it's shaped voter turnout in the state of California. And also would like to look at what trends we should be watching in the future as well. Certainly we have a special election coming up on November 4th, 2025. But let's look at the VCA. How does the VCA affect turnout in midterm elections compared to presidential elections? What were some of your findings there?
Yeah, so we found that the VCA, at least in the elections that we were looking at, which again, there could be something special about those elections, and only time will tell as we get more experience with this reform. But the midterm elections, we found the VCA had more of a negative effect than in the presidential elections, where the effect was a little more positive. And that was a little bit of a puzzling result for us. We're not quite sure what to make of it, but we feel like it does suggest that we should be learning more about that voting decision in the midterm elections and trying to understand whether people really did have some special struggles with the VCA in the midterm, or whether it was just something quirky about that particular election. It could also be that the presidential elections were quirky in the other direction, and that really in a typical presidential election we would see a negative effect of the VCA. So it's just we're gonna have to do a little bit more research to understand that, but it does certainly suggest that we need to do some deep dives into understanding how people are approaching this reform and how well they understand it.
Now, what kind of reforms or improvements, such as voter education or outreach, might help ensure that things like the Voters' Choice Act better serve new voters and underrepresented communities in the future?
Yeah, so I think it makes sense, given what we found, to be particularly vigilant during midterms. It also makes sense to maybe try and identify some of these voters. We did look into voter experience and how that shaped some of these effects. So voters who had experience voting by mail, for instance, didn't see that decline in the midterm elections. It was only the ones who either hadn't voted in the past or had had voted in person in the past, suggesting that in-person experience was a little bit confusing for some people in those midterm elections. So if we could maybe target some of our communications to voters who might have that extra struggle with the VCA, that might help improve the experience and improve turnout. We didn't really see much sign that people became more informed about the system as they had more experience with it. So the counties that adopted earlier didn't necessarily have higher turnout than the counties that adopted later. And so that also suggests that maybe the communication is not as good as it might be. There are requirements, as I've said before, there are requirements in the law about communication, but maybe we could make those more robust or make them more targeted than they have been.
Now, finally, before we conclude, do we need to see the VCA play out a little bit more before we truly know its impact on voter turnout, across several more election cycles, or do we kind of already have a good idea of how it's impacting elections over time? I guess, my question is, have we had enough time to determine the effects of the Voters' Choice Act?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would, and it's a little bit of a sort of personal opinion, I would say probably we've seen enough to know that we should consider some extra steps. You can always wait for more data, and it's always possible that some new election results will show something different than the ones that we've already seen. But we also had a lot of data to work with within each election, and we had a very robust approach to our question that really allowed us to isolate the specific effect of the VCA, independent of a whole bunch of other things that might otherwise be explaining our results. And so that really kind of makes you think, okay, it's always possible that this could change in the future, but maybe now that the first counties that implemented the VCA were in 2018, we're now 7 years on. We could always wait for another election, but how long do you wait before you try to make some improvements and see if you can make it better?
Well, Eric, thank you again for joining the Maddy Report today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit themaddyinstitute.org. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.